All right, welcome back to the program. My guest is joining me right now via Zoom, Dr. Afolabi Olowokere, who is the Managing Director and Chief Economist at Analyst Data Services and Resources. Dr. Olowokere, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Good morning, Nancy. Good morning, our viewers.
Good morning.
Thanks for having me.
Good morning to you too. Welcome again to the show. Now we're talking about 2023 budget. Let's get started from the title, really, or the theme of this year's budget, which is the budget of fiscal consolidation and transition. Why do you think this is? Why is it a budget of fiscal consolidation and transition?
Okay, maybe we can start from the transition part. I think Nigeria has a history of naming budgets, not only at the national level, but also at even sub-national level. There are some state governments that have very interesting titles that they give to their budget. If you look at 2015, for instance, our budget was also themed Transition and Hope. In other words, for most times, the year of the election, we always have in transition. So it's a way of saying we are transiting from one maybe government to another. And also may also be a way of showing that we are transiting from a very low level to a better level for the country. But when it comes to fiscal consolidation, I think that is where one day has to look at, are we speaking economics or politics? Because in the real sense, fiscal consolidation in economies can be described as government policies that are intended to reduce deficits and then reduce accumulation of debts. That is like an economic definition of consolidation. Whether that is what we are doing is a big question. In the short term, of course, that is not what we are doing. But maybe those that name the budget may be able to justify that we are taking steps towards reducing our deficit in the future. In other words, maybe whatever we are doing now in accumulating debt is to ensure that we have lower debt in the future and lower our deficit. But you may not be able to match or marry the way we expand deficits with the acronym or with the phrase fiscal consolidation. Thank you.
Okay. You're dragging me into debt already, and I know there's so much talking about debt in this year's budget. But let's quickly take this and let's quickly take the card which we've prepared. What you need to know about the 2023 budget, and I would take it from there. But I want our viewers to just take a look at some highlights of this year's budget. Like I mentioned earlier, budget of fiscal consolidation and transition, an approved aggregate expenditure of 21.8 trillion naira, which is the highest so far in the country, talking about aggregate expenditure for the country. 2022 budget implementation extended to March, and of course 819 billion naira supplementary budget for that. A budget deficit of 11.3 trillion naira to be financed by borrowing, just like the doctor was mentioning earlier. We will dig into that in a few seconds. The budget deficit hits a high of 55 trillion naira from 2015 to 2022. And that budget deficit is expected to rise to 77 trillion naira if the CBN loans are securitized. The CBN wins means that the CBN loans to the federal government is at around 22 trillion naira. So if that is securitized, according to what the DMO is saying or is canvassing, it will push our public debt to 77 trillion naira. Now, the borrowings, as you can see from local sources, 7 trillion naira, foreign 1.76 trillion naira, multilateral and bilateral loans 1.77 billion naira, privatization proceeds 206.18 billion naira. Is that really even privatization proceeds or even financialization? But Doctor, now let's dig deep into that very quickly, talking about the budget deficit and the debt. What are your views? I should say perhaps that's the most sticky point in this year's budget. What do you think?
Yes, it's a major point in this budget. You rightly said we've accumulated a lot of deficits over years, and accumulation of deficits definitely lead to your current debt level. You are going to accumulate debt for many years. It accumulates and then it becomes debt. Then you are going to be paying paying a coupon or interest or whatever you are paying on the debt, and that has a lot of implication on what you do. But let me start from this. We've said this point before, and everybody mentioned. I think I hear you mention that on many of your programs before. Borrowing itself may not be the bad idea. I mean, if you don't have something and you desire a good life, and borrowing is the only choice. I mean, sometimes it may be the one that is closest to you. You may have to borrow, but the question always is that what do you borrow for, and how efficiently were you able to utilize the borrowing? And the third point is that what are the implications? What are the tie to such borrowing that you are doing in terms of how many headrooms, how much is your headroom in the future? What's do you have to trade off for you to be able to maintain those? So in the case of Nigeria, for instance, as you mentioned, we are looking at a large deficit of about 11.34 trillion in 2023. But that is very huge. That is far higher than the budget of Nigeria for about 4 or 5 years before
even in 2020,
the current administration put together. So we have a huge debt. Borrowing, as I said, not a bad idea, but how efficiently are we going to use this? And major point is, what will be the implication of this on the rest of the economy? Where are we getting this money for? We are getting the bulk of the money from the domestic economy. We know the implication of that on crowding out. It also has a positive aspect. People that trade in bonds, people that have contributed to their pension, PFEs and the rest, and some institutional investors as well as mutual funds are able to see opportunity to invest their fund if they actually have the fund. But in terms of what the real sector will be able to borrow in the market, they are then crowded out by the federal government because of this. And deficit financing, as we all know, is also inflationary. So it then implies that the government is going to inflate the economy. When you then compare that with what the central bank does in trying to mop up money every time, then you then want to wonder how coordinated are the fiscal and monetary policies in the country. Another implication of this is that if we are unable to get all this borrowing from the private sector, as we want to do, we may still have to resort to the central bank. So it also has implication on the balance sheet of the federal of the central bank. And lastly, it has to do with capital. Oftentimes, when we are unable to get the kind of money that we want, it's has a lot of implication on our capital expenditure. So most times you have a budget that says I'm going to spend 4 trillion or 5 trillion on capital. But at the end of the day, in this year, for instance, we are looking at 6.46 trillion to be spent on capital. But last year, we were looking at about 6.23 trillion when you look at the budget and the supplementary. And at the end of November, we've just done about 2 trillion. We are even projecting that if it goes up to March this year, I mean, that is 2022 budget, we probably may be able to do about 4 trillion. So most times, our capital expenditure is not up to what we look at in our budget when we look at the actual. So debt has advantages, it has disadvantages, but a country has to be able to balance it and know how well it can make use of the debt, especially in the developing economy, where many of the buyers of those instruments can also be foreigners, which also has implication on foreign exchange. So Nigeria needs to find a way of financing its budgets, not only through deficits, because you can't expand debts or deficit forever. You must have surplus at this time to pay back. But I think it's something that the country needs to work on. It's important for our budget to be large, but it's also important for us to be sustainable in our debt management.
I like the idea that you brought up the point of, just like I mentioned earlier, 21.83 trillion aggregate expenditure for this year. This is the highest so far in the history of budget making in Nigeria. And it seems to always increase year by year. And we must also say that, of course, the budget deficit of this year is higher than even 2020's budget, as it were, just 2020, 2 years ago. The amount of... It's really mind-boggling. Just 2 years down the line, that our budget deficit was higher than the entire budget of the country just 2 years ago. Now, the question I would want to ask you is, dovetailing from what you said at the later part, which is looking for other options. What other options are there right now for the government apart from debt? I know that a lot of analysts are also talking about even equity and all of that. What do you think? At least you should have an idea of that too. And are there other options?
Yeah, there are options that most countries like us would do, but I think it's always very difficult. And I think that option, I will mention it, but I also come back to a caveat. We just have to raise, we have to increase our domestic resource mobilization, and that means taxation. Of course, not all of us like that. It may not be, I mean, government also has a smart way of speaking around it to say, oh, we will not increase the rates, we just want to broaden the base. Whatever the name is, we just have to do something about resource mobilization, basically, in a sustainable version. But the problem with that is that people must have trust in the government. People must know that my money will be utilized for common good. And they must also not see that, I mean, somebody says I pay tax, then I hear corruption cases tomorrow. Even though you may not be able to link the tax that you have paid, or you have just paid 10,000, but you have 1 billion case of corruption. I mean, your 10,000 is just it's a drop in the ocean of that money, but you have this feeling of, why must I pay? So I think service delivery, if we have governments that can build trust among the people, and then be able to show that I need this money, but when I spend the money, it's for the common good, and people can see the result. I think that is a sustainable way to build an economy. But you may not achieve that in the short run. So that's why most governments will try to say, can I borrow so that I can have facilities that can ease production activities, ease movement and things like that. And then later I can layer it with taxes, and then people will be willing to pay. But I think we also need to be more transparent in what we do in that area. Borrowing is an option, is what we do. Privatization is an option. But our experience with privatization, we have to be very careful. We know what happens to discos and the rest. We kind of sometimes lower standard for different kind of people who may not have the balance sheet or technical expertise to come into our sector that we have privatized. So that is something that we also have to work on. But in the immediate time, we need to start thinking about, what are we even spending money on? How can we be more efficient? How can we, there are two ways to increase your profit. You either increase your sales or you reduce your costs. Yeah. Sometimes it may not always be for us to always find a way of increasing our sales. We may actually find a way to reduce our cost. What are we spending money on that we are not supposed to be spending money on? Let me give you an example. I was looking at this budget and I was comparing it with the budget of several other countries. Actually, I was currently doing a work trying to see whether this budget aligns with the National Development Plan. And most times you see variances here and there. In many countries like Malaysia, Singapore, or even Canada, and India, Brazil, the portion of their budget that goes into defense and security sometimes is between 1% and 5%. But we are having close to 14% of our budget that goes into that. We understand that is a situation that we have found ourselves, but we also need to start in a sustainable manner to see, are there other issues, are there other ways of solving some of these security problems apart from fighting and buying guns and things like that? Employment creation, making people feel more involved and things like that. Maybe there can be national orientation. There can be other ways of also solving problems. We spend money on education, we spend money on infrastructure, but we also have to efficiently spend money on these things. Let me now end with that of infrastructure. Infrastructure financing is very important. There are places where it has been commercialized a lot, even though we have to be very careful as a country because we have some kind of very interesting or vested interests individuals. But we then, as a country, must be able to innovatively finance infrastructure. Government budget may not be able to adequately finance infrastructure. We must be able to see infrastructure that are efficient, be produced and efficiently managed. There are capital in different parts of the world that may want to come into our infrastructure. We can design our terms. I think ICRC has been doing a lot of work in that area. But we need to, as we go into the new government, we need to see more of that. We need to see roads that are tolled, if they are properly managed and the costs are affordable. We need to see bigger vehicles that can move people around so that cost of transportation can be lower. We need some kind of private provisioning of basic infrastructure that also creates markets and also enable private sector to thrive. If we rely on our annual budget to finance what we need as a country, we will go to what you just said. It's a trap. Incremental budgeting system. Every year, we are going to be adding 5 trillion or 4 trillion to our budget. But even in our budget, assumption of growth, we should 2%, 3%. Then somebody would then ask, where would the extra 3 trillion or 5 trillion goes into that we are unable to move our growth from 3 to 5 to 6 to 7, if possible, even to some low-level double-digit growth rates? Thank you.
I think, Doctor, that question should really be for those of you that are economists, because if you're seeing having a budget of 21.83 trillion naira and your growth projection for this year is about 3%, which is around population growth in Nigeria. So how do you balance it out? You know, but one would say there's a deficit of about 11 trillion naira, and that's 21.8 trillion naira. So how do you really balance that this quantum or this budget size, and you're having a paltry 3% growth for the country of over 200 million people? But that would be for those of you that are economists to answer and to see if you can really balance and rebalance and adjust there. But quite interesting also that you mentioned, let's talk about even private sector, because very interesting for me in this budget is that 22% of this total budget, the revenue rather, will be gotten from all sources, then 78% from non-all sources, which includes both non-all taxes, independent revenue, and others. What does it really say for chasing or getting monies to finance this budget from non-all sources, also including private sector?
Okay, so it's very, very simple. There may be smart way of saying that people will pay more taxes, you know. I think it was Reagan that said that when government says we are your friends, we want to do this on your behalf, they probably will come back to tax you more, you know. So private sector definitely have to base up for more taxes because government needs money. And it's also very difficult for government to lower its expenditure, be it, or it appears to be difficult, be it recurrent or capital. We always want more capital, but without also reducing our recurrent. So definitely our budget will always be rising. So private sector will have to pay, whatever the name is called, whether the name is say we have to exclude some people, introduce some things in the Finance Act, go into spectrum, into telephony, or go into maritime, there will always be any sector that is doing well to actually pay more taxes. Another thing is that businesses, especially the corporate ones, especially the ones that are formal, and that's another issue that Nigeria needs to start dealing with. It's important to be emphasizing MSME, but more importantly, in many places, we must also find a way of integrating and scaling them up. MSME are very useful, but you must also find a way of having big firms. So for the little big firms that we have, they are the ones that probably will pay more in terms of what the country needs. Another one we should mention, and I think is one credit that we can give to the current government, trying to bring the government-owned enterprises into the budgeting process. I think at the last count, they were able to bring about 62 or 63 into the current budget, trying to see some of these agencies that also have money. Let's start bringing it. By the way, that is one of the reasons why our budget looks so big. If you compare our budget of now with that of 2010 or 15, you may see big gap. Yeah, we have done more in terms of the size. We have also done more by bringing some of GOE's budget into the FGM budget. So that has also kind of increased. That's why this is the 80% budget including GOE's, budget excluding GOE. So when we are comparing number, we should also always consider that, especially when we are doing trend analysis. So bringing the GOE into the budget, into the framework is also very useful. So they can be more prudent, and I think federal government can then get more money for them. And I think that is why we are looking at a lot of money in terms of GOE's remitted surpluses. And that will also go into the independent revenue of government. I think government is looking at a high value in terms of independent revenue. It's looking at about 2.62 trillion in this budget. That's a lot of money. And if that money can come in, I think it's so. Two ways, government will make sure that its enterprises pay more. So whoever had the CEOs of those enterprises, they know the implication of this. I've spoken to some of them before. I know that some of them are even constrained, but they still have to pay because that is what they got. That's a Population Act is a law. They have to comply. So government enterprise will pay more, and the private sector is also not excluded. So we then have to find a way of balancing that against our passion, our conviction that we want the private sector to grow, we want to give incentives to private sector. And I think sometimes people have to sit down on the table and then address and say +1 - 1. Are we at 0? Or it's even +1 - 2? Maybe we are at -2. And I think that's one of the points that Taiwo Oyedele was trying to say made on your program earlier. We just have to see how much taxes are people really paying. Is it even productive? Is it something that they would like to do willingly? Or most of them would rather evade such taxes or avoid such taxes or fly to other part of the world to do their businesses.
Now that you brought the issue of taxes, of course, in this finance bill, the proposal, we're not saying that VAT will be increased, though VAT is still at 7.5%, to the best of my knowledge right now. And yes, at least last year, and even I think in 2021, we saw that VAT contributed, VAT collection, VAT revenue contributed significantly, at least to government's revenue. But there's also a lag there, whereby we've seen that because of non-compliance, we've seen lost revenue of VAT of about 3 trillion naira. If the government is saying now that it's going to be getting about 78% of non-oil revenue, of revenue from non-oil sources, the government is not going to increase VAT, at least for now. We know that CIT and PIT is still where it is right now. No increases yet. How should government mobilize this revenue? Bearing in mind that this is also a worsening economy, an economy that is struggling. Let me put it that way. Taiwo Oyedele said something to me when I spoke to him. He said, of course, the IMF says that Nigeria will not be in a recession. It's not among the countries that will be in a recession. But it will feel as if we are in a recession. We will not go into a recession, but it will feel as if we are in a recession.
Okay.
So for companies that will be feeling recession feelings, yes, how do you expect them to fare?
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, let's look at some statistics, for instance, just looking at recently. Whatever we have as budget revenue, we always don't meet up. So that's also kind of, is a more problem to the system. Let me give you an example. In 2020, we said we will make 5.4 trillion. We were able to make 3.4 trillion. In 2021, we said we'll make 6.6 trillion. We're able to make 4.6 trillion. And before now, before the supplementary budget or the latest statistics, which we saw in the minister's presentation when after the appropriation has been approved, we said we'll do 8.2 trillion for 2022, and we are likely going to do less than 5 trillion. So the first question is that, are we going to do the revenue, which is that we are looking at 10.49 trillion? Given that last year, when we say we'll do 9.97, putting everything together, we were able to do about 7. So by my estimate, we probably would be doing around 8 trillion, between 7 and 8 trillion, not the 10.49 trillion. That is one. Especially if you consider that we are moving to an election year, we may have a lot of issues. We may have people have to do quite a number of interesting things. In fact, it's possible we will have lower revenue in 2023 than 2022, except if something is done by exchange rate. If you have a devalued exchange rate and by the time you convert the oil money into naira, it becomes a lot of money. But that will not be much, especially given that we are looking at the non-oil sources. So we are still constrained. But it's always very good to have this assumption of we can make 10 trillion in revenue. From which economy, we are coming from a weak source. Monetary policy is doing its own to take money out of the system, and businesses are constrained. Exchange rate is a major challenge to businesses. Some of them are unable to get an official. The black market rate is way off what they can afford. I mean, I'm sure you go to markets these days, things that were sold for 1,000 naira, now they're probably sold for 1,600, 1,700. And businesses are, very innovative way. Some of them even reduce, they don't increase the price, but they reduce the grammage. I took some, which is 500 grams. It's now about 450 grams or 400 grams. So those are implicit way of introducing inflation and making, and inflation itself is a tax. So people are already taxed as a result of inflation. People are already constrained because of the accessibility to foreign exchange. Businesses are constrained because of resources, raw materials, and the rest. So it will be very difficult to make it. And we are moving to an election year. I mean, we are in an election year. 10.49 trillion is a very good aspiration, which we may not actually realize. But it definitely means that GOEs will pay, and businesses will also have to pay higher.
Okay, Dr. Olowoke, let's leave it at that for now, and let's see how this budget will go. There are so many components to this budget, really, and I'm afraid we don't have so much time to delve into that. But I